Whoa, today's discussion is quite heavy. Like to do code coverage with AI. Like AI is all the rage now, and everyone is leveraging it in a different way. No one, I think, imagined in past 2 years that we will be leveraging code coverage via AI, right?
Right. I think we should let's keep it light in that case. Let's not
Yeah,
because well, first of all, the people that are joining here are pretty smart guys and very cued in whatever is
yeah,
happening. But I think what we are doing or what we want, the way we want to do this webinar is keep it simple and light. So let's
yeah,
start that way.
yeah. So I'm just gonna share my screen, and I think we can start.
Sure. So I think the way we'll do this call for everybody else till Krishnanshu is sharing his screens that we'll first set up the context for the call with a couple of slides that Ushnanshu has prepared. But the meaty part of this webinar is going to be a demo, a demonstration that Ushnanshu is going to run. And the topic is right on the screen. We like to demo how engineers, well, developers specifically, can get their applications to more than 90% code coverage with AI, or simply put, without having to write any test.
Yeah.
Let's start, Prashnanshu.
Yeah. So as agenda was already discussed by Shailendra, like we're just gonna discuss what code coverage is, what are some types of coverages, like what are some traditional methods. If is coverage, like then Shailendra is gonna take up the topic to that whether coverage, high level coverage is actually equal to quality, like how this can be very misleading. And then again, we basically get to the point where 90% code coverage is possible without writing a test. And how is that possible? We're going to discuss it with HyperTest. I know, spoiler alert. And then we are just going to conclude our webinar with whatever we discussed as to what are some advantages of doing it via AI. So I think we can start. Yeah. So what is actually code coverage? I think most of the people who have joined or are joining in are very well versed in as to what code coverage is. Basically a software testing metric which measures how much of your basic code is executed when you have your test running. So any developer who is basically testing out their code needs to understand as to whatever the code is testing, right? Like they need to know how much of their scenarios of this particular test is actually covering, and whether I need to update my test with something or not, whether I need to update and make it modify it according to the scenarios that are present in my code, whether the test I have written is actually covering anything or not. So all of this is actually visualized via code coverage because in the essence you need to understand whether your test you have written basically they will ensure any quality or not, whether they provide any reliability or not. So code coverage actually enables a developer to do that. It's a very essential, I would say, essential tool in a developer's arsenal in order to test out
That's right.
whether the code is actually being tested or not. So and this brings up to the question whether there are some types of coverages. Some common types of coverages are like branch coverage, which is basically, it measures whether every possible branch or decision in the code has been executed at least once. Basically, it tests out any sort of branches that are present in your code. So, for example, if there is an if statement that might have, let's say, a logic there which tests out any, let's say, any number which is any even number, it is testing or something like that. So it will cover all the branches in that. Then there is function coverage, which basically tests the functional capabilities that are written into your code. Let's say if there are functions which is calling three methods, then that particular function coverage needs to check whether the all of these three methods have been invoked or not. Then comes your condition coverage, which basically helps a user understand any sort of conditions that are written. Let's say they have written conditions where x is greater than 10 or y is less than 0. Something like that is written in their basically the Boolean logic which is written into their code that is tested. Path coverage is basically testing the path that your code determines. So let's say you have 5 to 6 conditions that are written, and each of those conditions are basically leading on to different paths. So all of these paths need to be tested. So path coverage then comes into the picture. Then we have line coverage, basically testing out each individual lines into that particular code. And then there is, last but not the least, the loop coverage, which basically is to ensure that your code is not going into an infinite loop, or if there is any loop that's being executed, a perfect exit condition is there, which is not, which is basically being utilized to exit that particular loop. So, but there are some coverages which developers should care about. I guess statement, branches, functions, and lines are the only coverages that a particular developer should care about, because statements in a nutshell is a very important part of your code. Like statements actually define as to how your code is going to be executed. Like if an if statement is there, or if an else statement is there, that's actually going to define how your code is going to run. Same with the branches. Branches are basically going to define as to how your logic of the code is going to be there, what it's going to be predicated, and then functions and lines are equally important as well. So I think these are the four major coverages that a user should be, should worry about.
A developer, right?
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. So this brings us to the next question as to how to measure coverage. So there are a lot of tools in the market that actually cover coverage. Basically, with Python, you have, if you're writing your code in PyCharm, you can use PyTest Cov, and then there is
Yeah.
SonarQube, which you can leverage to you know cover see coverage for Python and Java. Then with Node, you have Istanbul, Mocha, NYC. Java, you have some OpenClover, Jacoco. There are a lot of tools there basically that cover the coverage. But the important question is that, is just coverage important? Like if I covered, let's say, 90% of my code, is that enough? Like, is that something that I
Well,
should be very assured about? So I
that's
think
not,
that's
not
my
yeah, yeah,
question to you.
that's true. So look, I talked to a lot of engineering managers, and I've seen this trend that almost 99% of all engineering managers believe that having high unit test coverage is the best insurance against bugs, and they're all probably wrong. And there are two simple reasons why having high coverage test is not equivalent to having high quality test. So what teams should sort of care about, well, the first problem is that even low quality tests can have high coverage. Now imagine, a developer, if you move to the next slide, imagine a developer who wants to uh, test a function that adds to numbers. And he writes a unit test that just asserts that the sum of these two numbers is a number, but forgets to assert the value. This is a classic example of a
Yeah,
test that covers all the lines of code, but would potentially miss a bug. That is like you see on the screen.
yeah,
So having high coverage test is not equivalent to having high quality test. The second problem generally that managers ignore is that you should also worry about scope. So, the code does not live in isolation. It talks to a lot of external components like a database, uh, message queue, third-party APIs, downstream services. Uh, so it is possible that developers end up writing tests that covers all the lines that need be, but miss a problem because the component that the code depends on breaks and the tests don't cover for it. And why does that happen is that when developers are asked to write test, they basically write a good unit test which isolates the code and all the other components that it talks to. And that isolation is done by using mocks. And sometimes these external components that you're mocking change their behavior. But if you forget to update your mocks, these tests might pass. But because these components have changed their behavior, they will behave a different way when your code hits production, and you'll start seeing these unexpected failures. So, two important things that everybody should care about is that even if you have built a goal to get your teams to very high coverage tests, remember uh, to think about assertions. Good tests are built on good assertions, which is a skill in itself, and don't forget about scope. So these are two things that I feel most engineering managers should worry about.
and I think these two things are very important, as you mentioned. Like assertions verify your business logic, right? If you basically have wrong assertions there, it's going to be testing the wrong business logic. Like, let's say if it's not
Right.
just testing, as you mentioned the previous example, it was just testing whether that particular, it was not testing whether what the logic of the code was. It was just testing what the outcome was, right? So the outcome was whether
In a
that
way.
particular sum is a number, not whether that is actually adding two numbers, if I'm not wrong, right? And yeah, creating mocks is
So
an
what it
art in
was,
itself.
right, absolutely. So
Yeah,
just getting, just putting a goal of getting your teams to high coverage is not enough,
yeah,
and you should worry about assertions and scope. And I think the best thing that can happen to any team is that if they can somehow get to very high coverage without having to write test, and that is
yeah.
something that Ushman should explain us quickly as to how are we making that possible.
So, and I think this is the best part. Like how we are doing is via something called HyperTest. So the general idea behind HyperTest is basically you get integration style tests automatically without even doing any heavy lifting on your end. And these tests basically get generated from the application's traffic itself. You basically install HyperTest on top of your service. It generates telemetry data, records and generates tests based out of that data. And once a developer is making a change, then these tests can be rerun again. And basically, they tell you if there is any way that your application or a service has regressed. So it basically builds tests from traffic and test each and every line of code, basically asserts all the business rules and updates the mocks as dependencies. But the neat part about this is doing it automatically. And in the end, basic idea is that each and every change is being tested by the developer with a code coverage report, which basically tells him that what scenarios have been covered by the developer and what scenarios have not been covered by them. And I think we can move on to a platform demo where I can show the users where
Let's see.
how exactly it's
Let's
done.
see that in action. Let's see that in action.
So I'm just gonna give me a minute. I'm gonna share my screen again. Yeah.
And explain to our attendees again as to how you're going to make that happen once you have your project available. Okay. I can see some code. Nice. That's what developers are here for.
Yeah, this is I would say this is the heart of this presentation, I guess. Yeah. So just a bit of a context. This is a KYC application for a bank, which I am running right now locally on my system. So what it's actually doing, it's talking to a PG database, actually, a live PG database in the backend. It's using a PG database, and HyperTest is actually initialized on top of it as an SDK. So I just added a few lines of code here, and it's initialized now. So HyperTest is installed on it. So what this application is actually doing, it's basically doing standard stuff like onboarding a new user, basically providing some compliances, some managerial compliances, and then whatever happens in a standard KYC application, like being able to add a bank account, and then do some credit transaction, maybe pull out some statements, etc. So this is what it's doing actually. So now, by the virtue of sitting as an SDK on top of this application, HyperTest actually gathers telemetry data, and I'm just gonna move on here. Yeah. So this is actually HyperTest as an UI. So what I've done is just brief about HyperTest. It actually works in the principle of record and replay. In record mode, it actually records the application's traffic and generates telemetry data, records requests, its traces, its payload, its outbound calls, everything. And then whenever developer makes a change on their end, they can rerun these tests to figure out if their application has regressed in any way. So what I've done in order to basically generate this traffic, I've basically ran some Postman collection.
Can we show our attendees what have we actually recorded, what gets recorded?
Yeah, sure. So, but before I do that, I'll just like to give them some context as to, because it's a banking application. They might be wondering why there is no UI in order to generate this traffic. So just to give you an idea on that, I'm using Postman, a collection, to fire some APIs because I don't have a UI for this. So this is what I've done. I have just basically, onboarded this user Monty, provided some managerial compliances here, basically added a bank account, and then just did some credit transaction on this. So all of this traffic has been, easily captured by HyperTest. So I'm just going to open this particular one. So what it has done is it has captured the whole request and its payload, whatever request that's being hit on the service, which I basically did from Postman. Along with this request, it's actually also recording all of its outbound calls. So, and these outbound calls can be anything. It can be, in this case, it's a PG database, but it can be to a messaging service like Kafka. It can be to caching application like Redis. So it can be anything. So in this case, it's actually verifying whether this user exists or not by checking its mobile number, since Monty is trying to add himself via mobile number and an address. So, and then once it verifies this user doesn't exist, it just runs a simple insert command to add this user. So this is the outbound call that we have captured. Along with the outbound call, we have also captured or recorded its response. So this is the response of this outbound call that we have recorded, as well as the response of this particular request that we basically, that hits this service. So this is what it means when it says that, we capture, where we record the traffic from your service, live from your service. So, and we have done this for all the endpoints that are being, all the requests that are being there on this particular service, that hitting this service. similarly, this is the transaction endpoint that I use to basically do some credit transaction into this particular banking application. Now, what I did here was, and what I'm going to do here now is I'm going to introduce a simple bug in my application.
Or maybe, okay, I think we can do it that way. Or I was
Yeah.
thinking maybe, yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yeah. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce a simple bug in my application. This is a transaction endpoint, which is basically doing a credit transaction. So I've just introduced a very simple bug in my application, which basically instead of doing a debit, it's credit, it's doing a debit. And I'm going to run this, run HyperTest again. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to run HyperTest with the neat part about this is I'll run HyperTest locally and going to run a test locally. And what it's going to give me, it's also going to give me a code coverage report. So yep,
Okay, that's what
that's
I
the
want to see. That's what everybody wants
yeah
to see.
yeah
So basically, what you've done is that you basically have a project, which is basically, as you said, was a banking app.
yeah
You set up the SDK. You can make it record from any environment. Just for a developer friends here, you've already had a Postman collection. You fired that collection as soon as you got your service up and fired that
yeah
collection. It recorded and all those requests with the traces, which means essentially the responses and outbound calls. So that
yeah
became the test suite. And then you just sort of introduce a small problem, I'm assuming somewhere in the code, and run those tests
yeah
again. So what we are seeing here is whatever test you've recorded with those
yeah
Postman collection, which could either be also be a traffic coming from the UI, which was
yeah
converted into tests. It might run, are now run, and it is reporting which exact lines of your code got covered,
yeah
right?
exactly. So with statement branches and lines which got covered, and notice I have a coverage folder that just got created, and we're just going to come to this. This is very exciting, by the way, like how exactly
Achha.
coverage is being present. So just going to
Hmm.
quickly show the results here. So what I did, as you mentioned, I deliberately inserted a bug in my application, which was like earlier
Hmm.
this application was doing a credit, now it's doing a debit. So what HyperTest has done
Right.
in this case is that it has actually caught that bug, it has actually caught that regression. So what it does is
Hmm.
actually in the test results, it shows you a regression report of sorts. So this regression report
Hmm.
in the left hand side, you can see an expected response. So if you remember when I mentioned earlier that we capture the response of the databases, we capture the outbound calls that the database, like this application is making to the database, right? So what it does, it automatically mocked the state of the database. It automatically created a mocked response by seeing as to
Hmm.
what that database is basically giving this particular service when this particular request is made, when this particular outbound call is made, and it automatically asserted the business logic here as well. So what you see
Hmm.
here is that earlier I had a balance of $10,000, and if you remember, I
Right.
was basically doing a credit transaction of $500, which I recorded earlier. So when I
Hmm.
introduced the bug and ran this test again, instead of doing a credit, it's
Hmm.
doing a debit now. And this regression has been
Hmm.
flagged. So it also has flagged which was the erroneous database call that it made to the database and what was it,
Hmm.
what was it, and what's the response here. So in essence, what
Hmm.
it's doing, it's automatically, uh, uh, getting the testing data from the application's traffic itself, from the services traffic. It's automatically providing
Hmm.
all the assertions here. And best part about this is that since you mentioned mocks are very important, it's also mocking, providing the mocks automatically for any third party dependencies to this particular service. So there's no need to actually provide any of this. And the best part about this is that it's also giving a code coverage report, which I'm just gonna come here. So if you remember, I ran a code coverage along with this particular test. So it created a
Hmm.
coverage report here, which I'm just gonna open in a
Hmm.
browser. Just give me a minute. Okay, yeah, yeah. So it actually tells me how many statements, branches, functions, and lines of this particular, I would say, code I have actually covered with this with the test that were generated by HyperTest. If I want to look into this more granularly, I can just
So
go to this
I
file.
think the correct way of saying this is the coverage for the test that were recorded by HyperTest.
Yeah,
So just sort of to be
yeah,
clear, we don't generate any test. We just record the activity or traffic of your application and then convert them into these tests, which then can be replayed. Yeah. So no writing of
yeah,
any test scripts. Yeah. Go ahead.
yeah. So The best part about this is that, as Shailendra mentioned, there's no need to write any test. It's automatically giving you what, how many functions, branches, lines, or statements you have covered. And if you want to look into granularly as to scenarios you don't have covered, and this is a very big part. So every time a developer writes a test, it's always I would say a hidden challenge that he doesn't know, or he or she doesn't know which part of his test is not, like which part of his code is not being covered by these tests. So
Mm,
in this code coverage report, we also tell you like what scenarios have not been covered by these tests that were generated. So all of these scenarios you can see, all of these lines you can see in marked in pink, are the scenarios which are not covered by HyperTest right now because we didn't get traffic for it.
mm,
So
mm.
as you can see in the line number 41, or if I go downstairs, you can just see, scroll down, you can see all of these scenarios that are not covered by HyperTest right now. But the neat part about this is that I'm just going to create tests again from the traffic itself and cover these scenarios immediately. So yeah,
Yeah,
I
great,
think
great. Looking forward. And by the
this is,
way, we've not built a new code coverage tool. This report is generated by NYC using NYC. So all
yeah,
that we do is that we record, build test, and automatically build in assertions. But to produce the report like this, use tools like NYC, Istanbul, or any other tool that I think Vishnanshu mentioned in case you're using a language other than Node.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
go ahead.
So
Let's see. So what are we
yeah,
trying to cover now?
yeah. So what I'm going to show here is that you can see a few scenarios here, right? Like I'm going to cover a few scenarios. Like in the onboard new
Mm,
customer scenario, you can see that there's a scenario which says that please fill required field correctly. So this particular scenario is not covered. So this means that if the length of the, like whatever value I'm giving as a name, if its length is less than 3 characters, if address length is less than 5 characters, and its mobile number's length is less than 10 characters, then this particular scenario is covered. It was not covered earlier because we were able to add the user with current correct required lengths. So I'm just going to cover this. I'm just going to cover this particular scenario as well, which says basically to update customer address. And then I'm going to cover another scenario which basically is to get some particular statement from whatever amount that I have present for a particular customer ID. So I'm just going to
okay.
run HyperTest in record mode and record these requests again.
Mm,
So HyperTest is running in record mode. So I'm going to fire these requests to get some traffic.
mm,
So I got the statement here. Now I'm going to basically do a create onboard a user with incorrect character limit for mobile number. Yeah, it says please fill
mm.
the required field correctly, which was the desired output. Now what I'm going to do is,
Nice, man. This looks very neat. I'm going to be
yeah,
expecting that we see this covered next
yeah,
time you generate the code coverage report. Mm,
yeah. And I'm just going to update this customer ID's address, this customer's address, which was again another scenario. Okay, this one, I'm just going to use another one. So I'm going to create an account which has already been created. This is also a scenario which we have not covered. So yeah, this account already exists. So this is another scenario which we have already covered. Which we didn't cover earlier. Now we have covered that. So you
mm.
can see these requests will be popping up here.
They did. Mm,
Yeah. So the statement got here, all the outbound calls that it's making to any third-party services. And again, the onboard user, this is an erroneous call because the required field was not covered. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run code coverage again. Just give it a minute. I think the create account request also popped up, which was to
mm,
basically, yeah,
mm.
basically or adding an account that already exists, I guess. Yeah. So I'm going to run HyperTest again with the code coverage in replay mode.
Mm-hmm.
Give it some time, maybe a few seconds. Yeah.
Can we just scroll up a little just to for us to see? So it's reporting coverage on CLI, right? What was
Yeah.
the reported coverage earlier, and what it is now? It is definitely increased. I can see, but if you just scroll up, the okay, I think you maybe cleared it all.
Yeah, it got
Oh,
cleared.
gotcha.
So
Okay.
yeah,
Gotcha. No problem. No problem.
but what we can see here is that these scenarios have been covered, right? Like the statement scenario, like I have just refreshed my coverage from the folder itself because this folder is there in my local directory. So I just refreshed it. No need for me to copy the path again. But you can see earlier this whole scenario, these scenarios were coming out in pink, right? Because these were not covered. We actually covered the
Hmm.
statement scenario, like we actually
Hmm.
created test out of it and we covered this, and
Hmm.
then we covered the erroneous create new account scenario, which was to basically this customer already exists. We covered this, and we also covered this scenario, which was to please fill the required field correctly, which was basically me entering incorrect character length for the mobile number.
Hmm.
So if I
Right. Makes sense.
yeah, yeah, and you can see my line coverage has increased from 47% earlier to 63% now.
Okay. So all that
Yeah,
you had to do was that in this case, you fire those requests using Postman.
yeah,
This could have very well been traffic coming from the actual application, probably any
yeah,
other environment, a live environment.
yeah,
That got captured as request, basically the traces, and when you ran those requests, we were able to see how that those requests that we captured actually ended up testing real lines of code, and
yeah,
that is getting reflected in this code coverage report.
yeah. Got like
Okay, makes
absolutely.
sense.
So the biggest advantage here is that, like, I would say a key takeaway in this case is that you didn't need to write any test for this. Like the biggest issue with code coverage is that like automatic code coverage is usually not possible. So that's out of the window. But you can, in order to increase your code coverage, you usually have to write more tests. You usually have to update more tests. You have to maintain them. Keep on constantly modifying them with the adaptations that are happening on your code. So with HyperTest, it was not the issue. Like I just needed to go ahead and record some scenarios from whatever environment I'm recording it from, and these tests just get generated automatically. And the biggest thing about this is that there is no separate requirement for any separate environment actually. So I can do this all from a local instance as well. So I actually say this is a big win when it compares to doing all of this manually, because you have a platform which is providing you with a very high level integration test, which can be generated automatically from, and you can generate it from any environment actually. You can generate from a QA environment, any pre-prod environment, or even locally, and run these tests locally, integrate them with the CI. Like the scope is unlimited here.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Thanks for the great presentation and demo, Ushnanshu. As always,
Yeah,
this must have been really helpful for people who are attending. I think we are sort of very close to ending the webinar. It's already running close to we're in the last minute. In fact, we promised to run and these webinars around the time limit that we promised to attendees. So I think with the last 30 seconds. So what we'll do is probably we have a couple of questions. We'll quickly take them and then we'll end the webinar. The first question that I see is the usual thing that any developer I would have expected to ask. What people are asking is that would this work for all other kinds of code coverage tools that are available to measure coverage for applications built on other languages? I think you showed this for NYC. So what the question is about is that if the application is built in another language like Python or Java, would it still report the same coverage as you reported for this node service?
yeah. So yeah, we are currently on Java and Node. So for Node and Java, we have code coverage. We are not available for Python right now. So that's my answer. For Python, we
Right.
won't be able to do this right now. But for Node and
Okay.
Java,
So I
yes,
think
we will be able to generate it.
okay, that makes sense. And next question is how instantaneous is this recording? How instantaneously does get recorded for it to be available to be run later?
I think you saw that in the demonstration, right? When I recorded the use request again in
Mm.
front of you guys, it was instantaneous. Like those scenarios got created immediately. So as soon as you start initialize HyperTest on top of your service, recording starts immediately.
Right. It becomes a little difficult sometimes to ask questions when you already know answers to. So I'm posing these questions to Shranshu, but I always feel a little uneasy because I wanted to answer them quickly. But yeah, that makes complete sense. So I think we just had two quick questions on this, and again, great webinar. I hope everybody who attended found value. The quick summary is that, well, after HyperTest, anybody who's trying to chase high quality, high coverage test wouldn't have to write test at all. The icing on the cake here is that these tests are integration in style. They can not only test your code, but everything that your code talks to and depends to. So you basically get, two values at the price of one, or maybe whichever you look at. It's a complete package deal for developers. And as developers, everybody would agree, nobody likes writing test. So I hope everybody found value. Thanks for this, Ushnanshu, and we will meet again for the next webinar. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.